It's so thrilling to be here with both Ann and Vivian in conversation to discuss Ulala Imai and her work, which I know we all find to be incredibly captivating and rich, not only aesthetically, but also, technique-wise. And also through the many layers of meaning behind each painting, as well as their various interpretations. So I'm sure we'll get into as much of that as we can in the next hour. There's so much that we could easily do that and more. So why don't we just go ahead and get started? I actually wanted to start with the title of the show, which I think raises an excellent starting point for our conversation. It's at the scene. And I'd like to unpack the scenes in Ulala's paintings, starting with their subject matter. So maybe Vivian, perhaps you could jump in and talk about the artist's history of painting these particular characters that you see there on your left, and her kind of history and evolution of using them.
Definitely. I had the opportunity to go do a studio visit when I was in Japan last month, I realized, which was not too long ago. And so the pictures that you see on the screen are pictures that I took during the studio visit. And it's really, I didn't know her, Ulala's paintings before I did the studio visit, but really meeting her and seeing her environment, then it really hits home and becomes how the environment impacts her painting so much. So and her studio is pretty much her home. So the living room, the kitchen, everything is used. And she does have a very active family life in that way. So that's why her studio is her home. So there's Vincent van Gogh. I mean, you start seeing many of the characters. And this one, you can see, and in the cabinets are many more of her motifs, she calls them, or characters that you see in her, that are reoccurring in her paintings. The teddy bears in the top shelf, you can see there. Oh, sorry. And then another recurring environmental motif is her garden. That's right outside. That appears in many of the paintings in this exhibition as well, and some of her other motifs and characters. So very much just her source materials are her from her own collection as well as her children's toys. And so she is painting directly her environment as well. So, and I think it was very interesting learning about, she's also hearing impaired as well. So when I was asking her, does it bother you to have like 3 children, like from 7 years old to teenager, working and playing? And even when I was visiting, her son was very wanting her attention. But she said that because, in a way, she can focus so well when she takes her hearing aids off, that it doesn't bother her at all to paint in the living room while the kids are going crazy, playing in the background. And in a way, she says that it's very nice that her family doesn't see, or especially her children, most particularly, don't seem to mind or care too much about her paintings, so then they don't get damaged either. So it's a nice symbiotic relationship and environment she has in her very active studio.
Yeah, thank you. It'd also be great to hear from you, Anne, about what initially drew you to her work, and also your thoughts on these characters, which you've been careful in our conversations anyway to distinguish between her paintings as illustrations. So I don't know if you want to touch a little on that, but kind of how you were first drawn to her work.
Yeah, I feel that Ulala's work is so much, it's not illustration in any shape or form. It's really about paint for me, first and foremost. And the subject matter, which Vivian speaks so well about, I mean, to describe it as an onlooker being in her studio and hearing what goes on, it's just, for me, her subject matter seems to be just exactly what she wants to do, and there's nothing stopping her. And so, dog, that's the dog, what's the dog's name?
Vincent Van Gogh, because
Vincent
of his
Van
missing
Gogh,
ear. She,
without an ear, that she's found and carried with her for years and taken.
in a market in Paris, she
Oh,
said.
yeah.
So she's kind of vintage dog, and she kind of sees herself in him because of her own hearing impairment.
Absolutely.
So, in many ways, associated with her, this painting in particular, I think, and it is a recurring motif to Vincent Van Gogh.
Vincent Van Gogh. Did she name it Vincent Van
She
Gogh?
named Vincent
Okay,
Van Gogh.
didn't have a little French name, and and so I find the humor in it, but I find also sadness and human love and cherished notions of obsession in her work, and things that we all know as humans, loss, found images that become something very important for you. But in this case, Ulala paints from life, from observation, and looking at her subject matter. So her subject matter is close to her, and very close to her. It's in her room, it's in her house, and she travels with it. Hello, okay? She travels with it when what she needs, she brings with her. I just recently found out, so it's not a secret. Maybe it is. No. But I think that that's incredible. I get it. I've done the same. I've traveled with valises filled with printouts of years of work, just in case I needed to think about something that I was going to be painting at the time when I was at the destination. And so I have like 5 valises filled with printouts that all dated and timed, so eventually at one time or another they can be lined up all in one long line of like a diary. And so I get that, and I understand the need to take with you just in case.
I think also that touches upon her her interest in collecting too.
Ooh, that was the next question.
Yeah.
Perfect
But go ahead,
segue.
if you
No,
wanna-
please.
I was thinking, when you were talking about like bringing those things, the precious kind of source material, or very personal too. I mean, very much for her. Seeing some parts of her collection at her home, but where she also shared that her grandmother, she kind of inherits this love of collecting from her grandmother, who was a single mother. And once her children grew up, then she started traveling each year and would collect at least one thing from each place that she traveled to. And then that's how Ulala, when she was growing up and saw her grandmother's collection of these unusual toys, especially the Green Gables in the back. That was when we started talking about. I said, "Who are these?" Especially that little man in the blue. And then she said, "Oh, that's my grandma from my grandmother's collection." So it's not only her own collection, but also this, her grandmother's collection that's been passed on to her. She just enjoyed how they were gathering. There wasn't any rhyme or reason or hierarchy to how her mother, like, from kitschy items to or figurines to kind of more well-made objects that she collected. They all formed together a cohesion of a group, and she just loved that, and I think that continued, seeped into her own practice and into her own painting practice of viewing these objects. So, yeah.
Yeah, you can imagine the fascination that a child has with things that are coming from other places and being, in one place, and with as well, you said that she has a hearing impediment, and so the visual, I imagine, for Ulala is it still is as potent as when she was a child, and so these characters that come back in the paintings and show up are the love of a time. It's also bringing back a time for her, so it's a nostalgic moment from the past. But for us, it's wacky and crazy and incredibly, for me as well, gutsy. And to paint something that is so personal and not care. She's just painting, and she's doing what she loves.
No, definitely she loves.
With paint. So first and foremost, it's a painting. And the subject matter for me is also part of the, obviously, part of the story. But she knows how to paint, and she really has this, incredible brushstroke that flows throughout all the paintings. So there's no hierarchy with the painting. It's just really good painting, and it's knowledgeable. Shouldn't say just really good, but it's knowledgeable. It's not. She knows how to use the material, and that's rare, and in a way that you don't get. When you see a painting, to see a painter that really knows how to paint with oil, by the way, it's not acrylic, which also fascinates me because she's with her kids, and and I was using oil paint since I was 6 years old. My mother and father gave me a set of oils that was my aunt's and a whole bunch of stuff, and I was allowed to paint in my room with oils and turpentine, and because my family were roofers in Boston, and they weren't afraid of solvents. And most parents wouldn't even allow you to, touch an oil stick, let alone turpentine. So I was taught how to use, wash your brush with turpentine, not a problem, because they used kerosene to wash their hands. So most people would be arrested now if they let their children do it. But, parents, meaning, letting their children use oil. So I think, and I'm fine, nothing happened to me. I don't have lung problems, and, so having the children around you while you're painting is fascinating to me. It's like a film in my head with Ulala painting and the kids running around, and it adds to the genius of her brushstroke, I feel, this like energy.
Yeah, I was thinking too, along the lines of collecting, there's this heritage you were talking about from her grandmother's collection. I heard her father also he's a collector of sorts as well. So there are these associations with care, with intimacy that you get from the works, but also with memory. And so I was hoping you could speak about her idea of collecting from a personal yet universal perspective, and how these characters, the Chewbacca or the E.T. or the honey bear, they're quite familiar to most of us, and yet the artist has this personal connection to them as well, and perhaps we do too as an audience, our own personal connection to them. So if you could talk a little about that.
I am very interested in how these characters are vintage. I think, Anne, you brought this up before, like they're vintage toys, and so there is definitely a level of care that there's time that they also represent too, and that level of care as well. So I think it really shows through in how also she treats them in the paintings as well, and kind of imbues them with their own characteristics and their own kind of a persona as well, that I really find fascinating, even the Snoopy. At first, I think when I first learned of her work in LA from Rodney Nanaka Hill, and when he was doing a group show and she was included, and then just seeing her works at first, it was kind of described as pop or something, but I feel like they go much further than pop. It's not about the consumerism or just the object itself, but she kind of creates this, in a way, make-believe, or allows imagination, or leaves it open for imagination in that way. And from her own perspective of starting from this very personal object, and inviting others to come into these scenes, right? Yeah.
The scene.
The scene.
And in a way, back to her painting, the brushstroke, it's also teaching us about the movements that she reenacts each time. because it's not only the, the dog, what's his name again? The Chewbacca. So if you notice, it's not only just Chewbacca, but it's her brushstroke each time. It's almost like it's the same, not the same ever, because it's a different time, it's a different place, it's a different moment. But it is, if you look at the eyes of that Chewbacca and you go out front and you look at the eyes of that one, you'll see her brushstroke, and it's, it's like a memory of the last. So in a way, they're very much about the nostalgic part of, maybe for Ulala, is also painting. To paint it again and again and to reenact it again and again, but it's never the same.
No, that's a great point, that they're recurring, that keeps on returning
It's like
to
listening
these.
to a song again,
Yeah,
but it's
yeah.
different. It's a live version,
That's a great point. I mean, that yellow bear has shown up in so many of her paintings too, as well as Vincent van Gogh.
This yellow bear?
Yeah, the yellow bear in different ways, also with a monkey.
Did she name this bear?
And she did, at least I don't know. I just know Vincent van Gogh.
We ask her. Call her up. Melody? Melody.
And we were talking a little bit about the light too, and that one definitely. So today I was able to see this exhibition in person, and to see that painting especially. I mean, the kind of inner light or this glow that comes from her paintings is so palpable, so powerful too.
Yeah, we talked a little bit on the phone, on a Zoom the other day, all three of us, so we got to talk a little bit about that, different things that we're talking about now, just to let y'all know. And light came up, the subject of light in Ulala's work. And, if you go in the back room has a painting of the moon on the left. And if you notice, there's on the right hand, on the bottom, there's just this like brushstroke of white, or not white, it's off-white, but it's, it's light. It's like, but where is that light coming from? It's coming from way behind you, through many trees, so it just snuck right in there. She did a really great job with that light. So the rest of it is dark except for the moon. And then, but the light, in this painting, for example, has, an all-over effect, more abstract, I guess. Everything she does is abstract, but this has more of an all-over effect, whereas the moon painting has the light that's very, very quiet, almost silent. And we did talk about silent. I'd like to talk more about that later.
Yeah. Just returning briefly to the characters, and then we can move beyond. For me, I think, when I consider them, that some of them, well, they're obviously from pop culture, some of them, not the food works, which you can see under the piece Melody with the bear and the banana, but the Chewbacca and the other characters. But for me, I can't help but think about consumerism, and I know that's maybe not her central goal, but the socioeconomic or the socio-political kind of suggestions that they make. And I wondered, because these are very much like accoutrements of the middle class, if this is something that she consciously thinks about, even as there's this other personal or kind of narrative or autobiographical side, and if you had any perspective on that.
I don't know if I can grasp that consumerist idea, because I really feel that she's painting from her heart, and it's about what she loves, and we're not us or you but it's the viewers that we're the victims of what it might be, they might seemingly think is consumerism, but I think it has nothing to do with consumerism in that blatant manner, but it is about an object that was made by someone else's idea of why this is going to be a big seller, because it's already in the world.
I also think that it's, so I don't, at least personally, I don't feel from my few interactions with her at least that she's critiquing consumerism or, but she just takes delight in the objects. I mean, even, she was a great host too. When I came, she had like French cakes ready, like these beautiful cakes from a nearby French bakery. And I mean, and I was like, well, this can become a painting itself. The cake was so beautiful on this. She even had it nicely presented on her dish and everything. And so I think she just, her eye to detail and appreciation for detail and beauty. And yeah, I think it's more that than.
Yeah, I agree completely. It has nothing to do with a critique of consumerism for Ulala. I couldn't imagine it. But I think that it being something that we respond to as humans, because we might have had the same reaction in the film, that Chewbacca came from, that's our own problem. I think she's really painting from her heart and from the love of her objects, of her.
And I think she doesn't, like even collecting and that fascination with her grandmother's collection, that she kind of saw in it interesting that so many things, these kind of different hierarchies are all collapsed
Yes.
in this collection with kitschy items, with things that might be seen as pop or low culture, and some things that might be more higher culture made objects. So that's kind of interesting that maybe she goes beyond consumer or thinks outside of that boundary when she approaches her approach of these objects as her subject matter. Which I thought it was very interesting when she kind of brought up that, like, oh, my grandmother's buying all these kind of works. Look how interesting, and they're all together. And then that's how she kind of also continues in that way in her, like these gatherings and her other paintings that she, like the summit, like where they are meeting together, and this unusual circumstance maybe, but in her paintings they all make sense.
Yeah, I thought we could also talk about scale because, for her, she's been experimenting more and more with scale. You can see with some of the pieces, they nearly touch the floor and the ceiling. They really envelop you when you stand in front of them and kind of draw you into them. And it, for me, kind of is back to the title again, where you're really being drawn into the scene that the artist is presenting to you. So I thought, Anne, maybe it'd be nice to hear your thoughts on this and how Ulala both utilizes and innovates with ideas of observation and representation. You were kind of getting at a little bit earlier.
Yeah, when you look at Ulala's painting in a digital form, you don't realize how large they are. Like when we were talking the other day, they're huge. But I think the smaller ones that she makes as well have a hugeness to them, and there's no hierarchy. Because again, back to the paint, she uses smaller brushes, so the smaller brush strokes are going to be the same brush strokes in the larger brush stroke, in the larger paintings, so that she, has no problem. It's as though she just wanted to go larger, and but also having two canvases instead of one canvas is both for the sake of having painting in her home, but at the same time to see it, it's a lot of thought, I think, in her process to make it work in a small, where she's working in a space that is limited to getting too far back to see something this large. So her knowledge of painting is really just incredibly on target, So the brushstroke again, if you look closely, you'll see where a leaf does mean, it's really just a swish of green, but it reads as a leaf, and it's as though she used a larger brush and cares about making something larger, but also the utilization of larger tools for the sake of, making something work.
And definitely also when I was visiting her, she was talking about one day, like she was dreaming one day to have a larger studio than her home, which in Japan, especially near Tokyo, the houses are pretty low level and small. So, and she was very excited to come to the opening of the show, which she unfortunately got COVID, so she wasn't able to attend. But she was very excited to see her large-scale paintings for the first time. Like you said, to be able to step back and see them together, because she'd never seen them together. At the time when I was visiting her studio, she was working on a triptych. I think I have one picture of that. So this is the central one, the left panel of the triptych that she was creating, but she can't put them together. I mean, in her house, physically, there's no place to put them together, and neither the height of especially these two works as well. So her imagination is definitely very ambitious. She wants to go bigger, larger scale. So I think, and she does work from photographs and assembling kind of the scene. She has a space in her foyer, which is kind of like this corner. This one is the background. You can kind of see in the aquarium, it's there. And so she does often use that space as her setup for the scenes. For some of these, I could imagine, and that one definitely. So yeah, she's, I think just the space right now is limit.
Extraordinary that she has, she has the knowledge of seeing something really large before it's made, to know that this will go with this so well, or not so well, but it will actually act as a continuum and not a diptych. It's really one piece. But I like that it's just apart just a little, so it's got a reason for that. And it's really interesting.
I also like her cropping too, like also that big adds to the monumental feeling you were talking about, I think, for the smaller paintings as well. She does seem to enjoy the close crop more than a larger crop, at least right now. So,
It's like where she allows us to see, or where she stops the story or the crop again, is makes you want more, or allows us again to imagine what was beyond. Especially when I saw the setup for this, fascinated me that she did really bring in the whole everything, although it was a lot was imagined too, but a lot was really from observation, and so. Yeah.
You're very right that the visual is so important to her, especially since she is hearing impaired. And so she does kind of talk about, and I think that really does come across in her practice. And
That the visual.
The visual importance of that.
Yeah, and then again, with that said, there is a quiet silence to these for me that has, that makes me, come up close and look closer, look at, again, the crop, or, the blurred background, and why the edge of the dog is so crisp, it's making sense of a quiet moment and not asking you anything else but to look.
Yeah, I think when you're contemplating the paintings, like you're saying, there's almost these sensations to them. You can really taste the buttered toast, which maybe it's not in this exhibition, but, or feel the breeze or the coldness from some of them, or at least for me, there's this physical response that's really induced. And maybe that's what makes the seeing more than just a purely visual process. But you also mentioned before, once when we were discussing this work, that you can hear sounds sometimes in some of the paintings. Could you talk about that?
Yeah, well, the sound of color or the pitch of a color can be, when placed side by side, it can almost be like looking at a musical notes, or seeing. My brother was a musician, I was a painter, so I was always fascinated with seeing the notes that he would write on the lined paper. But anyway, the color, I just feel that color also has the same ability in Ulala's painting, and in other painters as well. But I feel this, again, back to quiet, like that painting there, it has a lot of high pitches, but the high pitches are controlled by the not so dark. There's not a lot of black there. There's a lot of mixed black, but it's not black. And so it allows you to hover in a way that's almost like, the in-between, someone singing, or the music in between, and then you hear the voice of somebody singing. But it has, that more, this is, to me, has more narrative, although it's still a quiet moment. It's because there's not huge different, there's not really darks and there's not real lights, and that one that has more light, so it's higher pitched.
There's also, hearing you talk about that, there's kind of a cinematic quality or drama sometimes in there. That one maybe not as much, but there's I don't know, there's kind of inviting us to imagine a story with these works, but not giving it to us either.
That dog is really sad, though. It's
That's pretty, very
it's
melancholic.
so sad, and at the same time, so seeing the paint and seeing the color, the tone, what we're talking about, it still has such meaning for me of sad but hope. There's hope, and because it's also a great painting. So. And
Just the turn of his head too. It's
no ear. Yeah. It's kind of broken. It's not perfect, which is really great as well to me. There's a lot of imperfections in here that are perfect, for all good reasons.
So many of these are still lifes. You talked a little about her studio practice and about the staging, and I don't know if you want to get into the sort of duration of the staging of some of these or the different ways or subtleties that she does that. But there are also landscapes. And I was hoping that we could talk about that and when the artist first engaged with landscapes and kind of the evolution of that, because you can see very clearly in this one that's quite easy for me to see facing this way. This diptych that this is outside of her in her driveway, if I'm remembering that correctly. But in addition to the inanimate objects, there are these landscapes. So I was curious to know your thoughts about that and how she sort of came to that, because she didn't start out that way.
I think, in many ways she is painting from observation too, like Ann said, in her environment. So, she's very proud of her garden. Obviously, Vincent van Gogh is standing in her garden, and so her garden reappears in a couple of the paintings in this show and other of her works as well. And I know during COVID, she also was, COVID, we weren't traveling too much anyway, so landscape, you could only depict your immediate landscape, and especially for her in the suburbs of Tokyo, very immediate. And so she did talk about an abandoned lot in her neighborhood that I think Old Man in that one with a teddy bear, but the singular teddy bear figure kind of against the wind and the broken landscape. I think that's from that abandoned lot that she also felt was going to be very temporary too. Also had this kind of immediacy that soon some developer will come and it'll become some other houses or some other buildings here. So then, so she brought her her motifs or her characters out there to paint. So I think she just looks for very interesting landscapes that she can, in a way, set the scene for her work, for her characters. All these environments, at least that I know of, are, especially in the last couple years, are her immediate environments that she's responding to.
I see the teddy bear as a landscape. I see it as a, as a still life. So it's playing with both far away, because, the way she used the blur, it's got depth, very, very much depth. And so, it's like a close-up of a an animal inside of a landscape. And it's using very traditional an idea of landscape and still life, because it is a still life and it is a landscape at the same time. But she's, using her own, it's very unique in an all-over sense again. Like, that is more technically a landscape, but to me it's much more about an abstraction, or it's more about playing with abstraction and with almost less space than the teddy bear. And there's a sky, of course, and there's, trees and everything, but it's the way she painted it that has more, it's more about an all-over.
I think both the inside-outside relationship is very strong in her work. So, I think landscape just naturally appears because they're both very intimate, that relationship for her.
Well, and this is to our left is such a landscape, and it's just kills me when I look at it. It's so great, and because it's like a family that's there, and it's inside of a flower garden, and it has the trees and the flowers and the sky. But again, I am drawn to the subject matter again. So, and the unique imperfections of these characters. But it is definitely a landscape that has, still, it's also still life. And still life, which is really interesting, because they're really lively. Yes.
Yeah, another recurring theme for the artist is literary references. So I was thinking of the Hamlet reference at the other gallery down the road with the Lucy. And there are several others. So I was wondering if you could talk about those poetic titles that she gives, or the other kind of literary references or influences that she has in the work.
She's a great reader. She loves books and reading, and so for especially Green Gables, we talked about a little bit. And I asked her, is that her children's dollhouse? And she said, no. She bought that one, and she was thinking of the Green Gables, the story and this is a story that she cherished as a girl. So it's a childhood memory, and I think a lot of the works, her paintings in general, come from memory, or how they evoke a memory for her. And so literature plays such a large role in that, in her memories and her life experiences as well. And then and also to mention that she did talk about traveling with her parents to Paris, every year when she was growing up as well. So it was a very, in a way, an international experience or worldly experience. So literature was just another way for her to learn about the world or learn other aspects of the world that's not in her immediate surroundings as well. So I think that's how literature still shows up in her work as subject matter as well as in the titles as well.
I would love to hear the titles. Yvonne, the title of this one? Care.
You mentioned that word.
Wow.
But I just love her titles just in general. They're so poetic. I mean, not even if they're direct references.
It's a poem in itself, the titles that she uses. And the title for that? Melody again, yeah. And is Vincent van Gogh the name of the
It's
painting?
Nocturne, right? Nocturne.
Nocturne.
Though in the past, I think there's another one called Vincent van Gogh, another painting of him.
And this title?
Because in Yvonne.
I don't know.
I don't recall that one.
I'm sure it's incredible.
Yeah, I'm really struck by how effective she makes these juxtapositions in the works, and maybe with titles that comes out a little bit, but the works are intimate, but they're universal, kind of like we were talking about before. They're really humble, yet kind of virtuosic as well. And I was just wondering what you thought in terms of some of her other influences, and if that aligns with this inside outside you mentioned, these sort of dichotomies. If there's anything else that comes to mind.
Well, she does talk about Manet a lot, Manet, especially for brushstroke, how confident. Actually, she talks about realism in that very kind of rough brushstroke, like that blurriness. It doesn't have to be distinctly that kind of realism, but so she enjoys, and you can kind of tell in her brush work, it is very light to her brush. So she talks about Velázquez too, how she admires those kind of Baroque artists as well. And that really comes out, and I think the admiration that she has for those painters comes out in what she aspires to in her own painting style. But yeah, those are some of the influences.
Yeah, or like the trees in a Caspar David Friedrich painting, very much for me, the painting of the moon in the background, in the back room, evokes the sort of intimacy of a Caspar David Friedrich, yet again, it's the brushstroke that draws me in, and I think that she has many ways to make sense of a huge surface like this, but it's almost like a musical, it's almost performative to look at her work and look at the way that she puts paint on the surface. It's very light, as Vivian said, it's very light, it's not over, I don't know how long it takes her to make a painting, but to me, it feels like it's just love and light and knowledge of the material, which is half the battle. But at the same time, it's not overworked. It's done and it's done. She knows it's done and it's finished.
She does describe it as like buttering toast, painting. I mean, there's definitely like this
That's
delight.
great.
I mean, that comes from
You can always get a
Yeah.
little more butter if you want.
Yeah,
and
spreading it.
Always, or not, you know. Yeah. I mean, it really does take guts to stop a painting, to stop painting at a certain time and not overwork it and not underwork it. But if you look closely at a lot of the surface, you'll see there's still canvas showing. There's still areas where she had the confidence to just leave it and That's it. It's really about the interplay of that area then. It's not about a leaf or a, or an eye like I was talking about before, but it is about paint.
I also like the painting in the other room, Rains, I think it's called, that one, where it's just the repetition of that mark, the light mark.
The deer?
With the deer,
Yes.
with the deer, yeah.
Yes.
That one's beautiful.
Yeah.
There's so many favorite works
Yeah,
in this
look close
section.
at those brushstrokes, and it's not wet on wet, but it's extremely hard to make something look wet on wet when it's not wet on wet. So that's what she did, I think, but we'll ask her. It's, so to know how much medium to put in to make it work on the dry surface of an already painted surface. Do I add another brush stroke? Do I add another raindrop? But is the surface dry enough? Is it too wet? She's not, I don't think she is a painter of wet on wet, but she does know how to make it appear to have no need to know. If you know what I mean.
And she does work quickly. I mean, I think she does.
Quickly with
Yeah.
knowledge.
But yes.
With many, many,
Confidence,
many
yeah.
years of knowledge. So quickly can be, if you just know how to do it, it's done, and that's it. You don't have to go back in on it.
I think she's surrounded by, her father's a painter too. And then also her husband, they met in art school together, and so her husband's also a painter. So it's very much around her too, this kind of art.
And her husband's father is also a painter, I was reading. So, so she's steeped in this. There are other ways of obviously understanding and having knowledge about art, but I was struck by that as well.
Actually, her father's studio is at the house right next to her house, so I accidentally went to his father's house first. Yeah, this is her studio, which is her house essentially, so next door is her father's studio, maybe also his house too. So it is a kind of interesting, the neighborhood, which is just a quaint suburban kind of neighborhood. Yeah, they all live near each other making, which I found fascinating.
And not to forget that she paints in oil. And so oil on canvas is, the smell is also nostalgic. Sometimes when I'll go into somebody's studio who's an oil painter, it's just, I paint with oil too, so I really like the smell of it. It's like going home, or being around it and knowing that this person's painting with oil is, and I'm wondering now if her father is also working with oil, or her husband, or her husband's father, or is she the only one with the guts to work with oil? I love that, because it's hard. But it's also, oil paint can be easier to work with than acrylic, because you can leave it, and you can, it's more, I can't paint with acrylic, forget about it. I don't know what to do with acrylic. It dries too fast, and so, but oil is, to some people, very hard, but I think it's just about the knowledge of the material, too. I'm not putting down acrylic paint.
So I knew this would happen, but we're already only 5 minutes left, and so I just have one more that I'm going to get to. But I'm really eager to know from both of your perspectives kind of what you think is next, or where maybe you see this artist going. I think for me, just to add something that you kind of touched on before, Anne, and actually maybe also you, Vivian, is that, these works for this particular show were all created during the pandemic. And so there is this like melancholic sense to them that you mentioned, and this, for some, isolation in time in which she was creating these. And so they're kind of imbued with a sense of that, but also with a sense of compassion that I see. So with that, I'm just curious what you think, where she'll go. We talked about scale. I think she's interested in pushing that. But if there are other explorations that you think might she might be interested in. I would be curious to know about
Definitely,
those.
talking about landscape, I know that she's very excited to be traveling soon, so that she's able to take them in different landscapes as well. So, yeah, I mean, these are very personal objects to her, and so I think in a way that, and so she was showing me she was going to come to New York for the opening of this show, which unfortunately she wasn't able to come, but she had packed already in her suitcase, and she opened them up when I was talking with her about her missing her opening. And she showed, like, Chewbacca was there, the bears were there on her suitcase, ready to go. Hopefully, she said, maybe I will come to New York. And so she was planning to bring them with her to paint them in a new scene, I guess, or a new environment. And so I think this, I think more and more landscape is showing up in her works. I mean, especially in this exhibition, I was more struck that there is a lot of landscape in the works here. So I think we'll see probably more landscapes and of different sorts, not just in her immediate environment in suburban Tokyo anymore, which will be exciting as she also scales up, or finally to have a physical space to scale up.
And to bring up the pandemic again, the idea of isolation, and but that time period, for me as well, it brought a sense of almost desperate need to just do whatever you want to do. Now is the time. Nobody's going to see it. It's time to just do what you really were afraid to do before. But she's always worked with these animals and things like this. But the placement of that, or, the Vincent van dog, just, I don't think she's going to stray too far from what she's doing, and making sense of her immediate environment. So that pandemic time was so potent for making things that were uncomfortable. Again, uncomfortable for good reasons, because if you're uncomfortable and you're making something that you're not really sure of, or but it's coming from the right place, it's coming from the heart, or it's coming from, again, childhood love of an object, of to covet, the coveting of something. So I think that's her direction, is just going to continue to go with that sort of comfortable, uncomfortable place that's not consumers, but about her world. Yeah. Well, can't wait to see it, though.
Yeah, me as well. Thank you so much, and thank you all so much for being here.